Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 3, where we turn to the modern history of genocide in Western Europe and the British Isles. We touch upon a number of different cases, including the Anglo-Saxons and ancient Britons in late antiquity, the early 11th century attempted destruction of the Danes in England, the pogroms of Jews in the Rhineland later that century, the 13th century Albigensian Crusade in France, the 16th century persecution of the French Huguenots, the conquest of the so-called Celtic fringe in the British Isles, the Spanish expulsion of the Jews in Moriscos, and finally, the destruction of the Vendée during the French Revolution. So, to start with, just how far back do we have to go in the history of modern genocide in Europe? I'd argue that the roots of genocide here are quite deep. For example, this 16th century map is a distinctly modern imagination of a lost ancient world beneath the common Celtic background of many European peoples. Like all maps, especially old ones, this is mostly imaginary, as it's difficult to indicate which moment or period in ancient times that the cartographer wanted to record these peoples. They didn't just magically disappear. The point here, as it relates to Reading 1, is that there is a hidden history of conquest and occupation beneath the surface level of history. Even today, there are parts of Europe where Celtic nations have survived, from Galicia and Brittany to Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, and parts of Scotland. This is the context for Reading 1, which is premised upon the widely noted distinction between the nation and the state. In a nutshell, a state refers to a geopolitical entity that is politically defined in terms of possessing sovereignty, whereas a nation refers to a socio-cultural entity that is defined anthropologically in terms of a culturally distinct group of people. The grammatical construction of a quote-unquote nation-state misleadingly assumes a singular correlation between these two distinct components. Yet historically, most modern states are actually composite formations made up of more than one quote-unquote people. It's hard to see the disjuncture between the singular notion of a nation-state that we so easily take for granted and the hidden history of diversity and heterogeneity that lurks beneath the surface level of history. This argument about the structural production of invisibility tracks with this slide from my Underpinnings Week 8 lecture, which was based on Mark Levine's theory of modern genocide. I reiterated a couple of weeks ago this top point about the repeat offender effect. Additionally, in order to highlight these risky hotspots, I've used the notion of zones of genocide to organize our syllabus on a geographical basis. But to connect with the author of Reading 1 this week, it's the second subpoint here that's relevant, which is that nation-states have an inbuilt propensity for genocide, insofar as they tend to covet homogeneity and seek to manage and repress any sense of alterity or difference. As we'll see, the erasure of difference in the production of modern nation-states can be accomplished a number of different ways, ranging from physical annihilation to displacement to assimilation. This, once again, recalls our slide from Underpinnings Week 4. Apparently, I just can't get enough of this anthropophagic distinction. As far as Reading 1, we're especially concerned with this notion of anthropophagia, or the process of achieving a sense of quote-unquote purity through the figurative devouring of outgroups by the social body of in-groups. Thus, whether through genocide or ethnocide, modern nation-states have a built-in tendency that covets homogeneity. This reflects the essence of sovereignty as a political technology that is defined by the absolute, unconditional, indivisible, unlimited, unaccountable, and irrevocable power within an exclusive territorial jurisdiction. Nation-states are not designed to protect diversity and preserve local autonomy. Rather, like all sovereign powers, they are fundamentally a centrifugal force, marked by a dominant center of gravity orbit. The conjoined history of genocide and European state formation dates back to the era of late antiquity and the disintegration of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. Now, we don't have a reading that corresponds with this content here, but it's an important context to consider as we continue fleshing out our genealogy of extermination discourse. Clearly, the keyword genocide hadn't yet been invented, but chroniclers from the time used some of these related words in Latin. For example, the phrase strages gentium referred to the slaughter of peoples. Likewise, the Latin word exterminare, it's different from the modern English word exterminate, as it meant to drive out or expel beyond the boundaries of something else. So even though the language was different, medieval people thought genocidally. This was partly a consequence of their disposition to radically simplify their world, its past and imagined future, into a story of peoples, in which some peoples rose and prospered, and others necessarily fell, on account of the Anglo-Saxon conquests of the ancient Celtic Britons in the first millennium AD. The next time I teach this course, I'll try to make a case out of this, but I'm just raising it here for your awareness. Now, the extent to which medieval tales of genocide were actually real or just talk is unknown, but there are probably countless examples to consider. For example, in the year 1002 AD, the Anglo-Saxon king of England ordered the killing of all Danes. Of course, the Vikings in England were no saints, but it was generally the case then, as it is now, that victims of genocide could become perpetrators, and vice versa. In this case, the Danes would soon retreat from England altogether after 6. Speaking of which, in reading 2 this week, Martin Shaw goes on to suggest that the Normans waged a brutal counterinsurgency against the Anglo-Saxons. So, this particular massacre here wasn't an isolated case. Rather, it was an episode within a larger historical chain of events. A more general lesson is that, when it comes to genocide, what goes around comes around. This pertains to our earlier theoretical point about the repeat offender effect. Moving on, the period after the first millennium was marked by the emergence, in embryonic form, of a Europe of sovereign nation-states, political communities which combined claims to constitutional autonomy as ethnically homogeneous. This process of political formation was consolidated by the increased monopolization of violence by monarchs, who asserted authority over the feudal aristocracy in order to supply and direct armed forces at the service of the Catholic Church in its campaigns to retake the Holy Land from Islamic rule. For example, this image depicts the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 AD during the First Crusade, which resulted in the massacre of Muslims, Jews, and Orthodox Christians. Medieval society was thus dominated by a warrior ethos steeped in militant Christianity, wherein mass violence was glorified, the spirit celebrated, and the outcome of genocide, or at least what we might recognize as genocide, essentially normalized. Here you see as well some documentary evidence of extermination discourse. The first example, by Pope Urban II, is basically a declaration of genocidal intent. The second is by a famous participant and chronicler of the Siege of Jerusalem. What ideological elements of modern genocide can we detect? For example, consider this slide from week 5 of Underpinnings. Beneath the second point, on collective psychopathology, we see the keyword eschatological, which refers to the theology of end times. This apocalyptic worldview was a major component of medieval thought and was especially genocide. This was particularly so after the turn of the first millennium, when the second coming of Christ was widely expected. Here's a slide from week 7 of Underpinnings, when we revisited the psychology of the perpetrator-victim paradox in our analysis of the strategic logic of genocide. I cited the mid-20th century British historian, Norman Cohn, whose groundbreaking book on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was preceded by an earlier work on millenarianism, or the belief in a coming cataclysm and the destructive arrival of utopia. So these related notions of eschatology and millenarianism are important ideological elements from the medieval era that prefigured the development of modern genocide. Anyways, back to the history at stake. We need to consider how the medieval glorification of violence, especially in the wake of the Crusades, was turned inwards within Europe. As noted in recommended reading 5 this week, for example, the year 1096 was devastating for Jews in the Rhineland, as Crusaders wreaked havoc on local Jewish communities along the way. The rationale being that if they were about to avenge the Muslims in the name of God, they might as well settle old scores, at least as they saw it, given the prevalence of religious anti-Semitism at the time. Jews were not the only domestic European targets of militant Christianity. Reading 4 by Mark Levine, for instance, talks of ancient tribal peoples of the Baltics, including the so-called Old Prussians, were conquered and destroyed in the 12th and 13th centuries by the Teutonic Knights. In this painting, we see a Catholic bishop toppling the statue of a Slavic deity, thereby depicting a cultural form of destruction that we may associate with ethnocide. That's not to suggest, however, that in the early 13th century, in southern France, the French crown launched the Albigensian Crusade in order to eliminate a Christian revival movement known as Catharism. Check out this historical image, and notice how the powerful knights on the left are about to slaughter the innocent civilians on the right. Now, it may be clear by now that the historical or temporal boundary Now, it may be clear by now that the historical or temporal boundaries between modern and quote-unquote pre-modern Europe are quite diffuse and indeterminate, as medieval methods of anthropoemic violence were still quite common in the early modern era. For instance, Levine also considers the witch craze in late medieval, early modern Europe especially interesting because of its gendered specific dynamics. But in all of these cases, this one especially, the perpetrators saw in their targets a source of diabolical powers, which Levine suggests provides a link to the collective psychopathology at the heart of modern genocides. Indeed, the key theme across these cases is the crushing of the deviant, or those who do not fit the emerging order of sovereignty. We see here a well-known depiction of the destruction of the French Huguenots, for example, as summarized in Reading 7. So, even as the Renaissance was ushering in a new era of humanism, the political reality of early modern Europe was marked by a general intolerance of state-sanctioned diversity, especially after the Reformation and the European wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries. Indeed, there were some old and new elements in the history of genocide during this period. On the one hand, the religious violence of the 30 Years' War, for example, reflected long-standing patterns of crushing deviancy, as with the witch burning. The fact that the scope of destruction during the 30 Years' War, which resulted in several million deaths, there was a major escalation in the development of total warfare. In this latter case especially, patterns of religious violence were mapped onto larger dynastic conflicts. As a result, the collective psychopathology of perpetration was not so much eschatological as it was earlier in the millennium, as it was geopolitical. Specifically, there was a toxic security anxiety that religious minorities could subvert the tenets of sovereignty. We see this enmeshing of religion and politics in Reading 3 this week, which is a chapter from Heather Ritt on pathological homogenization. As noted, nation-states do not exist to promote diversity. On the contrary, the dominant tendency is for nation-states to streamline, make homogeneous, organize people to be uniform in some sense. Again, this is accomplished through a number of different strategies, ranging from more anthropophagic strategies, like forced conversion or assimilation, to more anthropoemic strategies, like excluding minority groups from citizenship rights, or expulsion and extermination. We see this entire range of strategies during the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula and the formation of the Spanish state. In some ways, this case portends the rise of nationalism, although the grounds for annihilating differences were still religious-based, particularly with the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. The Moriscos, or Spanish Muslims, managed to hold on a bit longer, but ultimately suffered the same fate in the early 17th century. This case more explicitly points to the emergence of racialist thought in the early modern era, sangre, or purity of blood, which was an idea used to justify discrimination against the conversos, or the Jewish converts to Christianity, who were said to be unassimilable and irredeemable. Likewise, as we shift our attention back to the British Isles, we see a similar process in the centuries-long British colonization of the Gaelic Irish and Scottish Highlanders. Look at this chronological series of maps, moving from left to right, as the suppression of Celtic languages is a proxy indicator, pathological homogenization. Again, this was achieved a number of different ways. For example, Levine points to the 16th and 17th century military campaigns during the plantations of Ireland, particularly in what would become Northern Ireland, where there was a history of what we might recognize today as ethnic cleansing. This is a prime example of anthropoemia, i.e., the violent removal or extermination of outgroups. At the same time, however, anthropophagic strategies were often used, especially in Scotland. Elite in the lowlands were incorporated into the dominant power structure, especially after the 1707 Act of Union, whereas mass evictions in the mostly Catholic Highlands led many to either migrate to North America, later Australia as well, join the British military, or move to urban centers, where they became part of the proletariat in the emerging Industrial Revolution. Moving on, we arrive at our final case this week, with Mark Levine's analysis of the Vendée as what he calls a prototypical modern genocide. Here we can see how anthropophagia can radicalize into anthropoemia. This case began in 1793, less than 4 years after the start of the French Revolution, when there was a counter-revolution in the western maritime region of the Vendée. Conservatism and royalism still ran strong here, as the province resisted being swallowed up into the new order. Their uprising prompted the newly conscripted Revolutionary Army to wage a ruthless campaign of total war in the Vendée, Entire villages were razed, and entire populations were mass murdered, including women and children, resulting in as many as 250,000 deaths, making this a textbook example of a quote-unquote root and branch genocide. Now, at the risk of falling into the trap of definitionalism, this case raises the question as to whether the genocide concept applies. Recall the 4 group types covered in ethnic, racial, or religious groups. Now, one could argue that the Vendean people were a distinct genos with their own provincial culture, and that the revolutionary regime targeted them as a distinct ethnicity or proto-national group. But that's not why the regime targeted them as such. Moreover, that doesn't explain why the Republican Army deliberately chose a strategy for root and branch genocide. Indeed, there was an inherently gendered dimension to this assault, as the women of the Vendée, i.e. the root, were imagined to be responsible for the uprising, and that the children, i.e. the branches, needed to be nipped in the bud to prevent this from ever happening again in the future. But even in this imagination of the organic body politic, the Vendéans were not targeted as a racial group. Rather, this seems to be a classic case of a group being targeted for political reasons. Like Daniel Firestein's rethinking of the national group target during Argentina's Dirty War, the collective psychopathology of the perpetrators was columnist, or in cahoots with foreign enemies, threatening the imposition of a new order from within. This is often a crucial element in the process of radicalization, whereby relatively softer methods of erasing differences turn into more explicitly physical forms of violence. Now, I need to wrap up, but it's important to look ahead and see how our discussion of European state formation and pathological homogenization laid the roots for World Wars I and II in the 20th century. In this context, Levine points to the rise of mass politics and the diffusion of nationalism in the 19th century, especially after the 1848 revolutions. In Germany, for example, the mismatch between the idea of the nation and the reality of the state contributed to the late 19th century emergence of the Völkisch movement as a form of radical nationalism. The late 19th century French had their own version of blood and soil nationalism, especially after their humiliating defeat in the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, when an aggressive form of nationalism called revanchism emerged with the aim of reclaiming lost territories. By the 1890s, moreover, right-wing nationalism in France was directed especially at the Jews, as the so-called Dreyfus Affair indicated a more radical shift in anti-Semitism. A common of anxiety of surviving in an increasingly competitive global system, one that was still defined by its inter-imperial character. In Western Europe, as we have seen, national homogenization and imperial expansion developed through the merger, expansion, and consolidation of existing kingdoms. As we shall see in weeks 4 and 5, however, the pattern was quite different in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Anatolia, where new nationalisms were forged out of the declining Habsburg, Romanov, and Ottoman empires. In any case, as the nation-state spread as an idea, it also transmitted its inherent risk for genocide. For the most part, this risk remained latent in 19th century Europe, although that was about to change, as the outbreak of international wars in the 20th century provided a dangerous opportunity structure for radical nationalism to thrive. More on that in later weeks. With that said, I'm done for this week. As usual, you have your weekly discussion forum. Additionally, you also have paragraphs due for both the I talked about the analytical essay last week, and I'll further discuss the case study next week. As far as your immediate assignment that's due, this is simply for me to check and see your selections, to make sure you're on the right path. You will still be free to change your selections after next week. In the meantime, please reach out to me with any questions, concerns, or ideas. And that's it for me.